Hello and welcome to ISSA's F-1 and J-1 students workshop for work authorization. This is a training for faculty and staff who work with our international student community and want to better understand work authorization options and the role that departments play in that authorization process. My name is Leah Zimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the International Student and Scholar Affairs Office, and I'm here with my colleague, Zaina, who will kick us off.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Zaina Karabatic, and I'm an Associate Director within International Student and Scholar Affairs. Given all of the information that Leah just mentioned, we decided to start this presentation with some of the main takeaways that we hope you all will walk away from with this presentation. So the first one, of course, all of us have a role to play in student success at the university and after graduation, but the immigration matters, of course, fall within the purview of the ISSA office. So please be sure to direct international students to ISSA for any questions related to work authorization, academic eligibility, etc. As Leah mentioned, sponsorship, we're going to cover sponsorship today. This has different kind of meanings perhaps for immigration purposes versus for employment purposes, which is often the context that students may be referencing sponsorship in, is with regards to employment sponsorship. To confirm, F-1 and J-1 students are sponsored by the University of Notre Dame, which means that we are the entity that have issued their immigration documents. It also means that a new visa status besides that F-1 or J-1 is often not going to be necessary in order for students to access work authorization benefits. So for example, something like CPT or OPT, it's a benefit of the F-1 status. It is not a new visa status. And then finally, off-campus employment authorization does require an element of academic approval that we're going to get into a lot more later. But this is a regulatory requirement, not something that ISSA is just asking for. ISSA is required per federal regulation to have this academic approval before we can move forward with approving or authorizing employment. And then there is an impact in signing off on such a request for you all as the approvers. So just when you're putting your name to that, that you are the person that we may be following up with if there's a question about that application. And similarly, you all have the academic expertise. So we are asking you to review the academic element of that student's request.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about what Zaina said with the sponsorship question and really clarifying what sponsorship means. This is often a really huge concern of our students, and what you may have heard a student say is, I need a sponsor, I need sponsorship, does this employer sponsor or not sponsor? And so we just want to give a little bit more context around this conversation around sponsorship. So this is a list of the alphabet soup of the US immigration system. And I would love if you recognize any of the letters on this US immigration alphabet soup list, just to throw in the chat which ones are familiar to you. Hopefully for everyone in the room, that F, academic student, and that J, exchange visitor student category is going to be familiar to you, because as Zaina said, those are the two that Notre Dame is sponsoring. And it's really the context we're focusing on for today's conversation. So thinking about what are the benefits, the work authorization benefits that an academic student, an F-1 student has, or a J-1 student has. But the university does sponsor other kinds of immigration statuses. And the one that you probably hear students talk most about that isn't necessarily university sponsored for our students is the H-1B visa. So that's a temporary employee visa. And so often when students are talking about sponsorship and they need sponsorship, the visa category, the visa type that they're referencing is the H-1B. So you'll see that in the first column. But as Zaina noted, for the duration of a student's program at the university, while they're enrolled at the university, they are sponsored by Notre Dame. So ultimately, that means that we issued the I-20 to an F-1 student, or we, the University of Notre Dame, issued a DS 2019 to a J-1 student, and that allowed them to apply for a visa. And allowed them to enter is allowing them to enter the US, allowing them to study at the university, and then it's allowing them to access the benefits of that status once they've completed their Notre Dame degree. And so the benefits, that work authorization benefit, is not something we would refer to as sponsorship, but it gives students in many cases the same opportunities as the sponsorship that they're talking about, which is I want to work in the US. So if you've heard students talk about, I need this sponsorship, they're talking about H, they're talking about the O potentially. Maybe they're even talking about permanent residency because some employers can sponsor that. But in this case, all of the students we're talking about are sponsored by the University of Notre Dame. And what they're most worried about when they're talking about that is, I just want to keep working in the US. I want to stay in the US. And often that staying for them in their mind, what they've heard about is that H-1B employment sponsorship. So one of the things, if you're from career development world, that we tell students is it probably coming up to an employer saying, do you sponsor, isn't the most helpful initiation or relationship builder with that employer. And they really don't need it for their first 1, 2, or 3 years after graduating, because the benefit of their status, the benefit of their sponsorship from the university allows them to work after graduation. And so we don't typically talk about sponsorship language when we're talking about F-1 and J-1 work authorization benefits, but they're ultimately, for the students' purposes and maybe for our purposes today, very similar in what they're accomplishing. And so the thing to just remember is that students are applying for that work authorization. Notre Dame continues to sponsor them. And that actually means that we still have some compliance responsibilities for them. And we have reporting responsibilities, and we have support responsibilities for students even after they've graduated. So if you don't know, our students are still reporting to us. For every student who graduates and applies for a work authorization is reporting to us for the first year after they've graduated. Some students are still reporting to us 3 years after they've graduated, and we're still advising them and we're still providing them support as they navigate employment in the US. But that's what that idea of sponsorship is. The students are really just looking for, how can I keep working in the US? In most cases, they have 1 to 3 years with their F-1 or J-1 status if they've graduated, and they are still being sponsored by Notre Dame. The other thing that I would say is, especially those of you who work with PhD students, often after they've graduated, maybe they have a non-tenure or tenure track, they have a postdoc position at a new institution, and often they want to get rid of this F-1 student visa status because they're like, I'm not a student anymore, I'm a professor now. And in some cases, that's fine. They're going to find an institution that will sponsor their employment, sponsor the H right away. But it is really important for students to understand that 1 to 3 years allows them to stay in the US for a little bit longer. And that's a benefit. We always encourage students, use up your OPT or AT, your work authorization benefit associated with your student status first, and then move into other kinds of sponsorship with employment, with an employment visa. So just some context for that sponsorship question. And I'm going to turn it back to Zaina to talk about employment types.
Great. So before we kind of dive into the different kinds of employment that our students access, one of the first things that we want to address is, what exactly is employment for immigration purposes? So the U.S. government defines employment as the rendering of services for any form of compensation. And what we really want you all to get from this slide is that monetary compensation is not the only reason that a student may need work authorization. Things like subsidized meals or housing, transportation, all of these things, if a student is receiving them for the work that they're doing, this is still going to be considered employment and would still require appropriate work authorization. We also want to include a small note about reimbursements. This question does come up a lot from our campus partners. If a student is only receiving reimbursement for the cost of, travel to attend a conference, for example, then this would not be considered employment for immigration purposes. If that's all that they're receiving is just that reimbursement, we would not advise that they need work authorization to receive that. So moving on to on-campus versus off-campus employment. So these are really the two buckets where student employment is going to fall. So first, for on-campus employment, some of the questions to kind of help us understand what we mean by on-campus employment for immigration purposes. So the first one, is the work happening on Notre Dame's campus? So on-campus work, of course, the majority of the time is going to be physically here at Notre Dame. However, if, let's say, for example, there's an undergraduate student living on campus and working remotely for a third-party employer, that would not, of course, be considered on-campus employment, because even though they're physically on Notre Dame's campus, they are not being paid by the University of Notre Dame. The money would be coming from that employer. And so the next question is Notre Dame the entity paying the student? One of the main questions is, where's the money coming from? And so that's something that we might follow up about if a student is asking about if this is considered on-campus employment. And for that reason, there are some examples of Notre Dame promoted or Notre Dame sponsored kind of employment opportunities that don't actually fall within this on-campus employment definition for immigration purposes. A common example would be something like the IDEA Center, which hosts a lot of startup companies. If a student is working for one of those companies, they are working on Notre Dame's campus for a Notre Dame affiliate, but that money is often coming from the startup itself and not from Notre Dame. So that would not count as on-campus employment. The final question here, does it provide direct service to Notre Dame students? The reason that we bring this up is because there are some examples. One of the common ones is that there is a third-party employer that partners often with the university, and they want to continue having the student work for them, even if the student is not eligible for off-campus employment authorization anymore. And so the question is, well, can we give the money to Notre Dame? And then Notre Dame gives the money to the student. And that is never going to be an appropriate situation for on-campus employment. And so that's really where this other question comes up from the on-campus employment regulation is, does this particular employment also provide direct service to Notre Dame students? So that's another question that we might ask when we're trying to kind of decide if this is on-campus employment for immigration purposes. So moving on to on-campus employment for F1 and J-1 students. So we've put together this little chart to kind of help differentiate the authorization options when we're thinking about F1 versus J-1 students. So for our F1 students, there is no work authorization needed to pursue on-campus employment. They're authorized from the moment that they arrive on campus. For our J-1 students, however, they will need work authorization for any and all employment activities that they pursue, inclusive of on-campus employment. This could be something like employment-related funding if they're getting a fellowship, or perhaps a grant for work that they're doing on campus, or just regular on-campus work like an assistantship, working in the dining hall, the library, something like that would still require work authorization for J-1 students, not for F1s. For both, however, they will both need to have completed ISSA's registration process upon arrival in the US. I'll note that this is going to be a requirement for them to complete the I-9 process as well. Both F1 and J-1 students are capped at 20 hours per week during the academic year. This does not apply during designated school breaks, winter break, summer break, spring break. They are not capped at that 20 hours during designated school breaks. And then finally, they will have to go through the process of getting a social security number, even though they may have the authorization for J-1s or they don't need the authorization for F-1 students, they will still need to go through that SSN process. So I'll turn it back over to Leah for off-campus employment options.
Yeah, so this is really going to be far more extensive, this section. And one thing that I will note as we transition to this is that once a student has graduated or reached the program end date on their I-20 or DS 2019, then they are no longer eligible for any off-campus employment. And even if they're working on campus at the university and they are a graduate of the university, for immigration purposes, they are now considered to be working off campus, and they would need some kind of authorization to do that. And so we think about off-campus employment in a couple of different ways. One is around when the student is doing it, because there are some different kinds of work authorization, off-campus work authorization available before a student graduates, and different kinds of authorization available after the student graduates. And so when you look at this list, you'll notice that OPT and AT, optional practical training and academic training, are on both lists, because students are eligible to apply for that kind of work authorization before they graduate and after they graduate, and the application processes are distinct. The one that's unique to before graduation, so before a student has hit the graduation date or hit their program end date on their I-20, or in this case, is curricular practical training, or CPT. And the only one that is only available after graduation that's distinct is the OPT STEM extension. And that extension word is really important because you are extending, the student is extending their OPT. So every student in F-1 status is eligible to apply for post-completion OPT. And if they have a STEM degree, then they're allowed to extend it. So this before graduation, after graduation, it's helpful to think through what is available to students. And it's how we talk with students, because they're going to have different requirements that they're meeting based on when they're applying for the authorization. So one note that we want to make, and we'll repeat this a couple of times, is that CPT, curricular practical training, academic training, or AT, and STEM OPT employment, they are all employer specific. They are time specific, they are job specific, and they are location specific. And this is really important for the academic approval process, and we'll talk about that. So where students, if they want to apply for CPT, AT, or the STEM OPT and authorization, they have to have a job. They have to have specific dates identified for that employment. They're going to be working with a specific employer, and they're going to be working at a specific place. And so they can apply for multiple employers and multiple positions within CPT, AT, and STEM OPT, but all of those are going to have distinct authorizations because of this employer-specific, time-specific, job-specific, and location-specific requirement that is in alignment with the U.S. regulations, immigration regulations. OPT, on the other hand, is a broad authorization for employment that's related to their major. So CPT, AT, STEM, OPT, all of them need to be related. That employment is still going to be related to the student's major, but OPT is the one that the student is applying for the authorization, and it is not based on a specific job or a specific employer. They're just saying, I want to be eligible to work for whatever period that they apply for. So a few notes about off-campus employment in general. One is that all of those four, again, we're going to introduce more alphabet soup for you, but that CPT, AT, OPT, and STEM OPT, all of those are a benefit of the student's F4J status. And it's important that we just understand students have a right to apply for those in many cases. It's a benefit. They don't have to do, they're meeting the requirements for that in terms of being enrolled, but it's not guaranteed. And so when we talk with students, sometimes they come to us and we have to say, you actually aren't eligible, or this employment isn't eligible for this authorization because of X, Y, or Z reason. It's a benefit, but not guaranteed. So a lot of times students come to us, they're like, I had this amazing opportunity, but it's not going to be approvable for different reasons that we'll talk about today. So one of the things that the academic approver and that process is helping us determine is the student met the enrollment requirements, and is the student in good academic standing? We don't know that necessarily in our office, so we're relying on the department, we're relying on the academic department to help us think through this and assess that. The other thing the academic approver is helping us with is this employment related to the major? And that looks a little bit different for each of these authorization types, but we're relying on the academic approver to help us assess that. And then our focus is really going to be on, has the student been here for the amount of time, enrolled for the amount of time? Do they have the documentation that they need? Do they have the information that we need? And do they have the eligibility requirements? So the academic approver has a role to play that's really important in terms of this, is the employment related to their major? I'll make a small note here too that many of our students have 1 to 3 minors, especially our undergrads, and no off-campus employment can be authorized based on a minor. It can only be based on the major. If a student has a dual major or has a concentration or has some other kind of situation with their academic program, that's fine. All of the employment that they're doing off campus still has to be related to those majors. And again, we're relying on the academic approver to help us assess that. And then each of these has a process. So again, not guaranteed that students are going to be authorized for employment just because they found a really great job or a really great opportunity. And that's why we encourage students to come talk to us about every off-campus opportunity. And we hope, especially the department administrators, that you would help us sort of push students in that direction as well, right? Like, it's one thing to have an amazing opportunity. It's going to be great for the student's future, but are the immigration regulations actually going to allow them to access that opportunity? And that's why we have this process in place for each of these authorization types. So I'm going to start with the J-1 academic training. As Dana said, less than 5% of our international students have a J-1 status. But it's still really essential that we understand what we need to do to support them. So a J-1 student is going to be eligible if their employment is directly related to their major. They must have been enrolled for at least full-time at the university at Notre Dame for 1 semester on the CVIS ID. And they have to have a job offer or letter of offer of employment before we can authorize them. So again, I talked about employer specific, time specific, location specific, job specific. So those students are going to have an offer letter that identifies those pieces. They're going to submit that to ISSA for the process. They're submitting the request to us. The academic approver is going to review their information and confirm for us that the student is eligible. And then we're going to authorize them for academic training by issuing them a new DS 2019 that has it listed, as well as a letter confirming that they've been authorized. So what is the academic approver confirming? This is going to be the graduation timeline. What's the expected graduation date? And again, for J-1 academic training, if you remember that earlier slide, it's available before and after graduation. And so if the student hasn't graduated, then you're telling us when do you expect them to graduate. And then after they've graduated, it's more of a administrative confirmation. This is when they graduated. We're asking the academic approver to confirm that they reviewed the offer letter and that it is actually connected to the student's major. And then there are 3 really important questions we need the academic approver to identify for us in the form. And Zaina's going to go over that form in a little bit. But the academic approver is confirming what are the goals and objectives of this employment? How is it related to the major, the student's major? And how is it an integral part of the student's program? Like, how is this building on or informing the student's educational experience at Notre Dame? So this is for J-1 academic training. That is the only kind of off-campus authorization available to J-1 students. So the next 3 types are going to be for F-1 students who are going to have an I-20 as a part of their sponsorship from Notre Dame. So the piece with CPT is that it has to be an integral part of the curriculum of their program. And the word established here is super important. So it has to be that integral part of an established curriculum. Occasionally we will have departments say, well, we can just create a class for this student so they can do this job. They can access this internship. But if it isn't something that's already in the curriculum and listed in the Notre Dame catalog and has credits associated with it, we cannot just create classes so that students can work when they want to work. Because one of the most important parts about CPT, it is not meant to facilitate a student's desire for employment. And all of our students really do want to work. They want to take advantage of their Notre Dame degree and the opportunities the university provides for them. But they can only do that within a U.S. immigration framework and the allowances of their visa status. So to be a part of an established curriculum in shorthand, that means that every student in the program is required to have an internship or off-campus work experience. So a good example of this is our MGA program, where every student is required to have a 6-month internship, or they have a different language for it, but some kind of experience off campus working with an organization. And that could be in the US or outside of the US, but because it's required of every student, then those students are eligible for CPT because that requirement will help them achieve their degree requirements, right? That internship engagement will help them achieve degree requirements. Not many programs outside of the MGA program have a required internship component. Another example may be within our ACE program. There's a couple of programs, but for the most part, that is not an option for most students. So most students are accessing this established curriculum because the internship is tied to a course and they are registered in the course. And one of the requirements of that course is an internship. And that course is going to help them achieve their degree requirements. So this is what that first part is super important. We still have that any employment is going to have to be related to their major. They have to have been enrolled for full-time 1 academic year in order to access CPT. So many of our 1-year programs, those students are not eligible for CPT or to be working while they're studying. the CPT students have to have a written offer of employment, and they're going to submit that to ISSA. The academic approver is going to sign off, and then we're going to authorize them, excuse me, with a new I-20 that shows the CPT authorization on it. That's the only way a student knows that they're authorized for CPT. So what is the academic approver confirming? They are confirming that the employment is related to the student's major. So we're asking the academic approver to please review the letter that the student has provided. It's all within our system that Zaina will go over in a moment. We're asking the academic approver to confirm, how is this fulfilling degree requirements? Is it fulfilling degree requirements because it's required for every student in the degree program? Is it fulfilling degree requirements because it's tied to a specific course that the student has to accomplish to meet their degree requirements? Could be an internship course. It could be a number of different things. Each college and school has their own version of this. Or in the case of our PhD students, if they have moved out of their coursework and now they are in the research dissertation phase, that research dissertation course is going to be the course that they can use for their CPT authorization, but the employment has to be helping them complete the thesis or dissertation. So again, it comes back to this idea that CPT is not meant to just facilitate employment. And if a student has already finished their coursework, they're only working on their dissertation or thesis to finish their degree requirements, then any employment has to be directly tied to helping them complete the thesis or dissertation. And so the academic approver is choosing that option if that's appropriate. But it has to meet one of these three criteria in order for the ISSA team to approve and authorize that student for off-campus employment with CPT. And in some cases, the academic approver, if we have the corresponds to a course listed in the catalog, if that's the case for a student CPT authorization, then we're going to need the course enrollment information. When will they be enrolled in this course, and what is the catalog code, so we can confirm. The next type of employment authorization that's available is OPT. I will say probably, and Zaina can correct me if I'm wrong, I think 99% of our students wait until they're nearing graduation to apply for post-completion OPT. But you saw on that before and after graduation, students are eligible to use OPT. We have students use OPT if they aren't eligible for CPT, but 99.5% of our students are going to use it after graduation. They're going to apply for post-completion OPT. So again, this note about the employment while they are authorized, even though they get this broad authorization, all of the employment, every opportunity has to align with the major on their I-20. Students have to wait until they've been enrolled for full-time 1 year to be eligible to apply for OPT, or by the time the OPT starts, they will have needed to be enrolled full-time. They do not need an offer of employment because, again, they're just applying for this broad authorization benefit. And there's a lot of flexibility in the kinds of employment that students can access. We have a video all about it from January that we have posted on our website if you want to dig more into OPT and the kinds of employment that students can access. So for OPT, the student is going to apply to ISSA. They're really applying for a new I-20 that has an OPT recommendation on it. And as a part of that process, an email is going to go to the academic approver, and the approver is going to sign off and say, yes, the student is in fact graduating when they've said they're going to graduate. So we have had more than 100 May 2024 graduates apply for OPT at this point, and they've been applying since January to now. We expect another 150 still to submit their applications. Those students, the academic advisor is just saying, yes, this student is expected to graduate in May of 2024, or they're expected to graduate in August of 2024 for those students who are coming up on that deadline. And then once that comes to us, we're going to issue that I-20 with the recommendation for OPT. The student is going to apply to the US government, to USCIS, and USCIS is actually going to be the one who authorizes them, and they authorize them by sending them an EAD card that says they can work for the dates listed on the card. So what is the academic approver confirming? Again, here, all we're looking for is the expected graduation date and that they've maintained good academic progress. And this semester, we've had a few faculty reach out and say, I'm actually not sure the student's going to graduate. And then we'd say, okay, then we have to hold off until we have more information about whether the student's actually going to be eligible for the OPT benefit by May. And so that's a conversation we can have, and a reason that an academic approver or a department might reach out to us and give us a heads up about a student. For PhD students, we are going to ask an additional question about when are they expected to defend their dissertation, because the US immigration regulations are much less concerned with an administrative graduation date than they are with the date that the student has fulfilled the degree requirements. And so fulfilling that degree requirement may be when they defend successfully their dissertation. It might be that the student needs more time to edit, to continue to work in the lab, to finalize additional details. So it might be the date that they submit their final dissertation, but it's not always going to be connected directly with that administrative graduation date. And so we just need that information so we can advise the student appropriately. If they tell us they've defended their dissertation in October of 2023, but they are saying that their program isn't going to end until August 2024, we're going to ask a few more questions about that, because we want to make sure the student's in compliance with the regs so that they don't have any negative impact on future petitions they have with the US government. So just as a quick note about, in these different scenarios, when will the advisor approve the request? And the first thing to note is that all CPT employment, every CPT employment request a student has to go through an academic advisor or approver before our team will approve it. And so if this undergrad has an internship after their sophomore year and after their junior year, then the academic approver will have to approve that for both internships. If we have a PhD student who is applying for CPT and they ask for 4 months, but then they're going to extend, they're going to need additional time to complete the project or whatever it is that they're working on, then the academic approver is going to get an approval request for that first 4 months, and then for any extensions, right? They're going to have to come back, because again, this employment for CPT is location, employer, job, and time specific. So if any of those details change, we need to go back to the academic approver and make sure that we've confirmed they're still in compliance. This is really similar for academic training, is that any employment that a student is asking for authorization for has to go back to that academic approver, has to go back to the department in some way. This can be a little bit tricky for academic training, because that student may be coming back and submitting those academic training requests 2 years after they've graduated, 3 years after they've graduated. If their academic approver is no longer at the university, then someone within that department is going to have to be responsible to confirm the relationship of the student's employment to their major, to their degree requirements, to their projects. But every time we are asking for that academic approver, it's because the regs are requiring us to ensure that there's a connection between the student's program and the employment. In our office, we are not subject matter experts, we're immigration experts. And so we need the help of the department or that academic approver to get us to the next piece. And then for the initial OPT application, it's really the simplest ask of the academic approver. We're just asking you to confirm, has the student graduated? Are they expected to graduate? Are they in good academic standing? And once we have that, again, this is a regulatory requirement before we recommend the OPT. We need that academic approver to help us assess that. And then we will issue the I-20 if the answer to that question is yes. So all approval requests, all of these processes are going to take place within ISSA Link, our immigration data system. And there's a whole assortment of things to know about that. The last one that I'm going to hit on here is just the STEM OPT extension. Even though we do not need an academic approver to participate in this process, the STEM OPT extension, again, is employer, time, job, and location specific. All of that employment must be directly related to the student's major as it's listed on their I-20. Instead of an enrollment requirement, students are required to maintain employment in their first 12 months of OPT. So a student is going to apply for post-completion OPT. They're going to maintain employment. They do have some unemployment days they are allowed in that 12 months of authorization of OPT. But if they have maintained their employment and they have a job at the end of that year to continue working, then they can extend their post-completion OPT with the STEM OPT extension. There's a few more restrictions about STEM OPT extension employment. One of the big ones is that students cannot be self-employed. And this is really challenging for entrepreneurs, for our esteemed students in particular, because they have to have a supervisory employee-employer relationship. And the US government has been pretty clear in some commentary that that supervisor has to be a US citizen. So we can't have two international students, two F-1 students join together, create a company, supervise each other within the STEM OPT extension. The STEM OPT extension requires that there's this employer-employee relationship, and then students have to be supervised by a US citizen permanent resident. The employer also has to meet some requirements of registration with the US government. And Notre Dame is an e-verified institution. And so all of our students are eligible to work at Notre Dame on the STEM OPT extension. And that's just helpful because we may see the STEM OPT extension come because we're sending students out, or some of the department administrators, you might have students coming to you with that STEM OPT. The STEM OPT extension, I mentioned already that they have to have an offer of employment. They also have to have a training plan, and the STEM OPT and the AT both have these training plans where we are signing off on a plan for how this employment is connected to the student's major. The student applies to ISSA for the OPT, the STEM OPT I-20, and then they submitted that to USCIS and they're authorized with an EAD card. So I would say, just again, nothing is being confirmed by the academic approver, but to our department administrators, if you have an employee coming to you who has that F-1 STEM OPT, then the department has to work with that student to complete the training plan, and whoever is supervising that student needs to sign off on the training plan. And that student's going to keep reporting to their international office every 6 months during the STEM OPT extension that they're still employed, they're still maintaining progress on the goals of their training plan, and that they're still living where they said they were living. So I'm going to kick it over to Zaina to talk about the academic approval process.
Leah, just really quickly, it looks like there's a question in the chat. If a PhD student has not yet scheduled their defense, can they provide the defense deadline or an expected date of defense, or is it best to wait until the student has the defense scheduled to complete their approval? Oh, you muted. Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, go ahead and answer.
Okay, so in this case, an estimated defense date would actually be fine for the purposes of signing off on that request. Of course, things happen all the time where perhaps a student is expected to graduate and then for whatever reason they fail a class, perhaps they have to retake it, they don't actually end up graduating, but they may have already applied for OPT, and there are kind of plans in place that we can advise the student on about how to navigate that while on OPT. So an estimated defense date for a PhD student would be fine. Okay, so moving on to the approval process. What does this actually look like in ISSA-Link? What are you all going to see and what are we asking you to do? So first of all, you may think, why am I in particular getting this request? And so the answer to that is that when students are completing their requests within ISSA-Link, we are giving them a chart, as shown here in the screenshot, to kind of help guide them as to who they should be listing. In some scenarios, we can see here a lot of the Mendoza business programs, there's a particular person who they should be listing to approve that request. But in some scenarios, for example, a PhD student, we're just telling them to list their thesis or their dissertation advisor. That's who's going to confirm this information. So we do have charts on the back end to kind of guide students as they're listing who needs to approve this request. I do also want to note that if you're receiving a request and you're actually thinking to yourself, I am certainly not the right person to be receiving this or to be signing off on it, please let us know and we can actually go back in and we can change the approver information so that it's going to the right person. And if it's actually on this chart, if the chart that we're providing to students is incorrect, then we can actually go in and update that so that future students don't list the incorrect person to sign off. So how do I know where I need to approve? So once a student completes their portion of a request form in ISSA link, and they have to indicate an academic approver, once they submit that part of the request, an email is automatically going to be generated to the information, the contact person that they listed. So as soon as they submit their portion, if they've listed you as the person to sign off, then you're going to get an email that kind of looks like this. This one is specific to CPT, but it's going to let you know that ISSA is requesting you to confirm information. We are going to provide a link in that email, and you will actually have to click the link, log in with your Notre Dame credentials, and then sign off on the form. We have a lot of people who they kind of see this and then they just respond to this email and they say, yes, I approve this request, which is great, but it doesn't necessarily answer all the questions that we have to have answers for. Again, this academic approval process is regulatory, so there are certain things that we need confirmation on before we can move forward. So it'll be through that email that you'll click the link to approve the request. So what exactly am I signing off on? So this is basically going to summarize a lot of what Leah articulated already. But for OPT, we're really asking you to sign off on, well, I guess for all of these requests, we're asking you to sign off on a student's academic progress. When exactly are they graduating? But for OPT, we're not asking you to confirm any sort of specific, any specific employment, because OPT is not employment specific like the other two are. For academic training for our J-1 students and for CPT for our F-1 students, we are actually asking you not only to confirm the eligibility, but also to confirm a particular position or employment. So we do want you to review the offer letter. When you're accessing the approval part of ISSA link, you will have access to what the student has already submitted. So we are asking you to actually go in and review the offer letter that the student has already uploaded to their request, so that when you're signing off, you know exactly what you're signing off on. So then for CPT specifically, so when you go in, and actually this would be the case for any of the approval forms that you're signing off on, there's usually going to be instructions on the very first part where we tell you exactly what we are asking of you. So for CPT, we're asking you to confirm, of course, when is the student expected to graduate? There are drop-down menus, so you'll really just select the appropriate response for that particular student. As Leah mentioned, we also need to know how that particular employment is curricular in nature for CPT, again, because the employment on CPT needs to be aligned with the curriculum and not just the student's desire for employment. So we're going to ask you to identify how exactly is this curricular? Is this, as the example of the MGA students, is this a requirement for every single student in the program? Or perhaps is this linked to a course that the student is taking that is counting towards their credits to graduate? Or in the final option here for like a PhD student, are they getting CPT for research that they're doing that's directly contributing towards the completion of their dissertation? So we'll ask you to indicate which of these is correct for this student. And then if you select that it is based on a course, there is a logic built into the system to have you indicate what the internship course is, or the independent study, whatever that particular program calls that course, so that we can confirm that the student is in fact enrolled for that semester that they're requesting the CPT authorization. And then I do want to also note that you can see in the screenshot here on the bottom that there is a note there is a box if there's any additional information that you think is relevant for ISSA to know about this request. There is a place for you to indicate that within the form. So we'll move on to OPT. I'm sorry, AT. Okay, so for academic training, so this is for our J-1 students. So again, the very first part of within the form that you're going to see are these instructions. I know this looks like a lot of information. I will note that the big paragraph at the bottom is a sample response. So we do give you an example of what you might input to answer the relevant questions. In particular for AT, this is going to be really helpful only because, as Leah mentioned, you're going to be asked to sign off on an academic academic training request, potentially a year or even more than a year after you've had communication with this student after they've graduated. And so it may be helpful to kind of reposition yourself as you're thinking about that student's experience and as you're confirming this information for that student. So we are asking you to sign off on 3 distinct questions in your response when you're confirming this academic portion for academic training. So the 3 questions are around, first of all, the goals and objectives of that particular employment experience. Again, AT is employment specific. We want to know, how is that particular work related to their Notre Dame degree? How is it related to their major? And then finally, how is this training an integral part of the student's academic program? How is it building on the knowledge and skills that they learned in their Notre Dame program? And so we are asking you to assess that because we don't have that academic expertise. And again, we do give an example that you all can refer to if you are being asked to sign off on such a request. Similarly, you will be asked to indicate when the student has graduated or if they've already graduated, as this will kind of inform the other questions they'll be asked to sign off on. And then for OPT, again, in this case, since OPT is not employer specific, we're not asking you to review an offer letter. We're not asking you to assess a particular employment position for this for any student applying for OPT. Really, what we want to know is the student graduating, first of all? And then if they are a PhD student, instead of the actual graduation date, we want to know, when is the anticipated defense date? As we answered for the good question in the chat, this can be an estimate of when the student is going to complete that dissertation. And this is really going to help us advise the student on the timeline for their work authorization, because OPT is very much tied to when the student meets their degree requirements. So I'll turn it back over to Leah to kind of wrap up with some challenges.
I just want to say too, Zain and I have been working through creating really short videos for each of those different work authorization types, so that if someone is just looking at a CPT form, you can just jump on and see a 5 or 7 minute video about the CPT, what are we asking you, and same with AT and OPT. So just a note that those should be coming this summer. What are the challenges? I mentioned this at the beginning. There's some systemic barriers for students, and then there's just some things that students maybe tend to struggle a little bit with more. So we wanted to name them for you. I think the first thing that's really important to understand is that the US government is really highlighted that F-1 students and J-1 students are in the US to study. And this is the last bullet on this first column, but their primary purpose is to study. And they are not necessarily invested in creating pathways for our international students and employees to access employment. So there are barriers, there are some pathways, but there are a lot of restrictions on that. There may be more in the future, there may be less. But those barriers come through with the regulatory responsibilities, requirements, with the restrictions on you can only work related to your major. And as we all know, students are doing such interesting things at the university. And it isn't always mean that you have a major, that's what you're going to do when you graduate. But they aren't necessarily able to use all of those experiences at the university to access different kinds of opportunities after graduation if they're not related to the major. So that's a barrier for students. It's a barrier for how we think about education. And how we connect students to using their Notre Dame degree in the future. And there's a lot of fees associated. The fees for OPT and STEM OPT recently just went up, and it's closer to $555 for a student to apply for those kinds of work authorization. And there's more fees for future petitions. And then the timelines. We are really prioritize processing OPT and STEM OPT requests in our office, but the US government can take 3 to 6 months to process those petitions for students, which impacts their ability to access employment. Again, it just isn't a system that is really engaged or proactive about helping students access. I mentioned earlier too about entrepreneurship is impossible within STEM OPT in some ways. And so we're encouraging students to be entrepreneurial and use their Notre Dame degree in really interesting ways. And the US immigration system has just made that really difficult in a lot of ways. So we help students navigate what are the opportunities they can access and what can't they within a difficult system. The other thing is that employers are working in that same system. And in the last 10 years, even really specifically the last 5 years, they've gotten really more specific about what the questions are that they're asking to find out, is a student going to need a sponsorship? Are they a US citizen? They can't really ask that citizenship question. So they're asking about, are you going to need sponsorship? And it's complicated for students because they will need it after their OPT, STEM OPT, AT has ended, but they don't need it for a while. And so employers are getting very good about how they ask these questions, that really results in some discrimination against those students who have a visa and are looking for employment. And so this is something that we talk a lot about in our team, and we've talked with career development, is like, how do we help employers really understand that 1 to 3 year limit is a barrier in some ways, but what could they accomplish with a Notre Dame grad for 1 year or 3 years after they've graduated? And there's so much potential there. But again, that's a systemic caution and a problem that our employers have. They're just, that cautiousness comes because the immigration rules have changed a lot in the last 6 years, and things that were an option aren't an option. So this is just systemic things that we can't do a lot about right now, but we want everyone to be aware of. Those are some of the challenges that students are facing from the system. The challenges that students have that we do have a little bit more control over is that understanding that language of sponsorship, which we already talked about. Students do have an expectation that the Notre Dame degree is going to help them do whatever they want in the world, and that will allow them to say yes to every opportunity that comes by. And that just isn't true for students who have a visa and have restrictions. And for all the reasons we've talked about today, there are some limitations, but we have a way to communicate those to students in a way that isn't despairing, but helps them just understand what are the constraints of your job search and what do you need to be focused on. And that's something we can all collectively assist students with understanding and being encouraging in that space regardless. Students have a lot of panic about stopping the unemployment clock. I referenced that in the first 12 months of OPT, they're allowed 90 days of unemployment within that 12 months. AT students are actually not allowed any unemployment. And then STEM OPT students have some additional days of unemployment. But there can be some worry and panic. And so we talk with students about what are ways that they could be flexible in how they approach work. How could they work with their departments, with career development, to help stop that unemployment clock rather than just being worried about it. Choosing the start date and navigating sponsorship questions on applications are other challenges that students have also had. One of the things, again, in the sense of like, what can we actually do, that Zane and I and our team have talked quite a bit about, are just what are some things to avoid. This isn't necessarily the place I want to end our presentation on, and I'll pivot back to Zaina for some final takeaways before we take questions. If you have any questions now, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll address them, especially if you have to jump off right at 11:30. We'll get them on the recording at least and follow up with you. But some things to avoid that we've just observed and that students have communicated to us that would just be helpful in terms of how do we support students in a relatively challenging environment. So the first thing is really just to avoid asking about a student's immigration status. Our students are actually relatively forthcoming about that, but it can be a sense of like, why are you asking? Do you need to know this? If you know it, you can certainly reference them or tell us to come see us. If you have a student you just don't know, and you're like, well, if you have a visa, you might want to make sure you talk to ISSA. And one question, I'll give Zaina credit for this, that she thinks about is this a question you'd ask a domestic student when you're thinking about a status question? And there's also a lot of undocumented students on campus that we don't ask about their status. And it does complicate the advising relationship, surely, but we really just encourage people to avoid asking specific questions about a student status. If they reveal it and that can help you get them to our office, great. We do a lot of communication with our students. They're in our system. But that's one thing we'd recommend avoiding. The other thing we just recommend that you don't do, even if you've been at the university for 30 years and worked with international students for 30 years, we just recommend you avoid providing any advice on immigration regulations or what they're able to do or not able to do, and point those students to our team. We're happy to collaborate with you. We're happy to be in a meeting with you and the student if you feel more comfortable with that. But the immigration regulations are not static, and they do change, and conversations change and guidance changes. And so that's what our office is tracking. So we recommend you bring them to us. A few things that we've heard conversations about our students have come and shared with us. It's just around language that can be somewhat triggering, and it's often also inaccurate. And the first one is we've heard a number of people reference, yeah, I told the student they need to talk to you or they're going to get deported. And our team does not use language of deportation. That's a really specific process in US immigration. And it's really fraught for students when they hear that. And it's just really inappropriate in this context. And anyone who isn't an attorney or a US government agent should probably not be using the language of deportation. So we really recommend, if you can take that out of your vocabulary, or just interrogate, like, when have I used that? If I've used it, how can I not use that in the future? And the other is just sort of other internationals have asked ISSA about that, and just this kind of clumping together. Each of our students has a really distinct experience within the US immigration system, and they have, because of their citizenship, because of their major, because of their time in the US and previous statuses, they have a really specific situation. And so this clumping together of internationals is really something we advise people to avoid. And again, just interrogate, where might have I used language like that, and what else might I use? What's other language that would have made more sense in that moment? And then the last thing is just assuming that students are going to have the same familiarity with US systems. And again, even a familiarity with the US immigration system. It's my team's responsibility to be experts on that system, and students are not experts. They have some responsibility to understand it, but that system is huge and complicated and challenging, just like so many other systems in the US are. And so we just always encourage people to think about, are you assuming some familiarity that the student has that isn't actually there? I'm going to turn it back to Zaina for the last takeaways, and to take us in any questions in our last minute.
Great. So hopefully at this point, our main takeaway points, which we started with at the beginning, hopefully they've been more contextualized. So we'll just review them again. Just that all of us have a distinct role to play in our student success, both during their time here at Notre Dame and after their graduation, but that all international students should be directed to ISSA for questions about work authorization, academic eligibility, etc. We've talked about sponsorship and how that means different things for our F-1 and J-1 students versus when they may be coming to talk to you all about it in the context of employment, that they may not need a new visa status in order to access work authorization benefits, as we've outlined today. They may already have several options available to them. And then finally, that off-campus employment authorization does require an element of academic approval, that this is a regulatory requirement that you may be asked to complete even after a student has graduated, in the case of our J-1 students, and that there is a significant impact in signing off on such a request, that we're asking you to attest to the academic relevance of that student's work, and that by putting your name to that request, you are the person that we would be following up with if there are any questions. So hopefully all of this was fleshed out more in the presentation and makes a lot of sense. So that's all of our formal presentation for today, but we do have time for questions. I know it's 11:30. We really appreciate you all joining us and taking time out of your day to learn about this. We hope it was helpful. As I said, we are going to stick around to take questions. If you have them, please feel free to, you can unmute yourself. We're a small enough group, I think, at this point, or put them in the chat, whatever you feel more comfortable with.